21 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table, I had an idea. I was a stay-at-home mum at the time. I loved being at home when my kids came in from school. My own mum was there for us and we loved it. We were watching the horrors in orphanages across the world unfolding on our TV screens in that year. It was one of the reasons why I decided to go to Russia to find a little girl that I'd met in Ireland who was recovering from the Chernobyl program. She was now back in Russia, locked up into her orphanage. And so out came the suitcases, packed with very serious items of humanitarian aid. Tea bags, Mars bars. We were all terrified of Russia at the time. I had crayons, bubbles, balloons to save the children's lives. Vladimir Putin was the new president of Russia. He'd inherited a very broken country. Post-communism had left thousands of orphanages and 850,000 orphans. I needed to find just one. So myself and a friend took the flight to Russia and a further 10 hours on that road through huge, vast forests, deep snow, the blackest sky I'd ever seen, the highest stars I'd ever seen. Our sky in Ireland isn't that high. We felt just tiny. We eventually got to the old rusted gates of our destination, and that's when we saw the children. Standing in silence, dark circles under their eyes, freezing. We were ushered into a dilapidated little room to wait for the director. A nervous little man eventually arrived, uncomfortable with Western visitors. I asked to meet the children. He reluctantly took us down long, dark corridors, and we looked into huge bedrooms, old metal beds wedged into rows full of orphans. There was an overpowering smell of urine. Green teeth, shaved heads, bruises. You could feel the aggression in the air. The oldest ones couldn't stand the sight of us. The youngest ones peeped out from under threadbare blankets, absolutely unused to visitors. We smiled at everybody. Irish are smilers. Nobody smiled back. It took me years to realize in Russia that Russians think that smiley people are a bit simple. I found my little girl. My job was done. My suitcase was empty. It was time to go home. The day I was leaving, a little girl ran up to me. Her name was Sasha. She had a long red plait, big blue eyes, and a face full of bruises. As we were kissing each other goodbye, she said to my interpreter, "Tell Debbie that I've never been kissed before." It took my breath away. At the very same moment, a little boy with big dark eyes, dark hair, put something into my hand. It was a note. I gave it to my translator. It said, "They've taken away my big brother. I don't know where he is. Please, can you help me find him?" I made a promise that day to that little boy, and it was a promise that went on to change my life. I felt that Sasha had given me more than a kiss, and I felt that he had given me more than a note. Both children had given me their hope and their hearts. And in turn, at the very same time, really without realizing it, I gave them mine. I came home to Ireland, to my warm, safe place, but I couldn't shift the images. We'd left those children behind in the snow, crying after our car. We'd left them with tamed rats in their beds as their only comfort. We'd left them in what I would consider to be hell. Sleep totally evaded me. I could not get my promise out of my head. I knew I had to go back. I got my nearest and dearest friends around me because there was an idea growing in my brain. And they all said the same thing to me. Don't even think about it. Somebody like you will never make a change in Russia. Why don't you have a coffee morning and send the money? So I thought, If they want a coffee morning, let's give them a coffee morning. So we laced the coffee with Irish whiskey. And in a few hours, we had 10 grand. We registered a charity called To Russia with Love. We had nothing at that point, only €10,000 and our love. We gathered a team of absolutely magnificent people. No egos, no religion, and no politics. We only allowed in those doors wonderful people, big huggers, huge hearts. I went to Russia with the dream team. We didn't know where to start. It was like staring up at Everest. We were looking at one of the worst places I'd ever seen in my life for children to live in. And in my mind's eye, I knew I wanted this to be the most magnificent children's home on earth. Only I had absolutely no idea how I was going to do that. But I couldn't tell them that. We started by smashing locks off all the doors in those long, dark corridors. Behind the doors, the beds were piled to the ceiling. Old, rusted wire beds, piles of ancient laundry, suitcases scattered everywhere with pieces of the children's previous lives in them, old baby shoes, old worn-out teddy bears, photographs from their previous lives of nanas and grandas and mummies and daddies that they had been taken from for different reasons. Wild dogs roamed right through the forest around us and watched us as we emptied the kitchens and the laundries of those rats. We stopped at nothing. We stayed and watched the children's daily reality. We knew we had a much bigger job to do than rebuild the place. We knew we had to rebuild every single child in it. The very first thing we did was learn two words. We hadn't a word of Russian between us. Most of us still don't, to be honest, years later. We learned to say 2 words, which was "Ty prekrasna," you are beautiful. They had never heard it before. They were absolutely stunned at this. We sat in the big kitchen every day as new arrivals came in, sat on those long, hard benches, absolutely terrified. One little girl arrived one day. Her name was Lilia. She had blonde curls and big green eyes. She was put in the corner with a red plate in front of her. She was 12. We went up to her to say hello. She tried to warn us away from her. Lilia had been on the streets for 2 years, and her red plate signified her disease. She had syphilis. We said to Lilia, "Ty prekrasna." Lilia broke into floods of tears. Nobody had ever said it to her before. And so the donations started to pour in, and the big build began. We planted thousands of flower bulbs. Our pink, yellow, green buildings popped up, white PVC windows. We changed all of the beds. We put in soft rugs under all of the children's feet. We bought all of the little ones' teddy bears. We let the children form an interior design team, and they replaced disgusting broken bulbs with the most hideous chandeliers you've ever seen. But we didn't mind. We replaced gymnasiums. We put in new libraries. We even put in a hairdresser's. And finally, we put in a magnificent room for their suitcases so that the children could go in anytime they wanted and visit their past. We watched long, shiny hair grow. We scrubbed their teeth. We brought doctors from Russia and Ireland, doctors, nurses, psychologists, social workers. We brought the best volunteers in the world. We even managed to find ourselves an iconic Russian astronaut who came to teach those children that they could reach over the walls and reach for the stars. He was just home from Mir, so no better person to give them this message. We found hundreds and hundreds of families all over Ireland that sponsored every child. Letters and parcels started going back and forward, and to this day, the most magnificent relationships still continue. At the time, it took years for the changes to begin to happen. We stood and we watched our children graduate as teachers, nurses, doctors. We stood and watched them become absolutely magnificent parents. We stood and watched them reach over the walls and reach for those stars. We had what was the most remarkable children's home in the world, full of the most beautiful children that felt loved, cared for, and absolutely respected. They also felt part of a huge family. We changed our name to Children with Love. We know better than anybody that orphanages are an absolutely disastrous place for children to live. We're working to get rid of them all over the world. Every single child needs their family. At the time, 80% of children in their orphanages that were leaving orphanages at the time, 80% of them ended up in drugs, drink, prostitution, or prison. After 10 years of us there, the combined team of Russian and Irish, only 1% of our children did. We became accustomed to Russia, much to our surprise, and we fell in love with Russian people. It was difficult in the beginning, because they've got very cranky faces. But actually, when you get past the cranky faces, they're soft, warm, old-fashioned. They were incredibly grateful that we came back again and again. Vladimir Putin was making big changes across Russia. He was a giant in everybody's head, his photograph on every wall. To us, it was like the Wizard of Oz. He was somebody in the distance to be afraid of. We'd no intentions of meeting him as long as we stayed off his yellow brick road. Until 12 months ago, I was doing a weekly shop in the supermarket and I got a telephone call from the Kremlin. We had just been awarded the highest award that can be given to a Western person for their work in Russia. And it was to be presented by Vladimir Putin himself. So I thought that was definitely we were actually extremely honoured. And it was really, I was dying to have a look at him in the flesh, to be honest. So myself and my right hand for the last 20 years flew to Moscow. We arrived at the airport. We were greeted by the most stunning girl straight out of a James Bond movie, standing at a car sent by the president. We were whisked through the streets of Moscow, blue light flashing, the traffic parting like the Red Sea to let us through, directly into the inner sanctum of the Kremlin. As I was being brought to my seat, I thought about our children. I looked around me at the champagne, the caviar, the magnificent room. We had just come through 2 enormous golden doors. I knew for sure now we were in Oz. I took my seat. To my left, to my shock and horror, was the Russian Pope, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. I wondered who had placed me beside him. The seat to my right was empty. I looked down at the porcelain plate in front of me, and I thought about all those plates piled high in the orphanage. I thought about Lilia and her red plate. I thought about Sasha, who told me she'd never been kissed before. I made a silent toast to our children. We had come from my kitchen table, and now we were sitting at the Kremlin table. I knocked back a vodka quickly to cope with the conversation with the Pope over lunch. But as I was doing that, I was tipped on the shoulder by a giant security man with the wire coming out of his ear and into his collar. He wanted to introduce me to the man who was going to be sitting to my right. I looked up, and looking down at me was the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. Suddenly the Pope was a very small problem. I literally forgot my own name. I didn't know what to do. I actually went into a kind of a blind panic because nobody had prepared me for this at all. After the initial blank, I then kind of thought, like, should I be chatty and friendly? Will I ask him, has he ever seen Gogglebox? Has he seen, like, does he know what Game of Thrones is? Where does he go on his holidays? Like, what? Nobody prepared me for this. And like, in our country, it's easier to talk to presidents. They're less intimidating. I settled down took my elbows off the table because I could hear my mother's voice from 3,000 miles away saying, "Don't put your elbows on the table." I settled down, and without being indiscreet, I have to say, he was cultured, patient, with my endless chatter. He was welcoming, informative. He speaks multiple languages. He was absolutely thankful to me for all the work we have done. And he wanted to reiterate again and again that we should all be concentrating on the things that bring us together rather than the things that separate us. I had one of the most powerful men in the world sitting beside me. I thought he'd stay a few minutes and then leg it because it was a huge, big PR event. Actually, he stayed for 2.5 hours. We chatted easily for 2.5 hours. No matter what your politics are, it is good to talk. That day he asked me to go up on the stage and talk to 100 million people on Russian TV. And my main message was that all children need a family and we need to see the end of orphanages all over our world. So, my magnificent team are still together 21 years on. My mother holds my house together when I'm not there. My children are the light of my life. Was I a desperate wife for the last 21 years? Absolutely. My husband was and still is an angel. And then there's you. If I was to give you one piece of advice, I might say don't ever go to a coffee morning because you could end up doing 20 years in a Russian forest. The TED people tell me that I'm allowed to make an ask for the charity. And much to the horror of my board, I'm not going to do that either, because I think we have bigger magic in the room today. We still have our programs in Russia, and we have a magnificent scholarship program in Ireland as well, with children with huge challenges in their lives, and we do need support. But to be honest, I really feel between us all, there's 1,000 people in this room today, and I would ask you all just to do one thing for me in honor of those children. I want you to think about just what can you do that's going to make our world a kinder place. That's my one ask to you all. Those children in that orphanage gave us their hearts. They trusted us with their futures. They changed their lives. They changed our lives. And I'm hoping that today their story might just touch your life. If you think about it, my story started with a kiss, and it went on to change the lives of thousands and thousands of children. And I couldn't stand here today without introducing you to the little girl who is no longer a little girl, Sash. I couldn't... This is Sasha, who's the little girl I told you at the beginning of our story who had told me all those years ago that she'd never been kissed before. So I'd like to really end by saying that my one message to you all is, when you leave here today, please think, what is that one thing you can all do to make our world a better place? Keep your cross.
Thank you.
Thank you.